Perhaps you know this scene from the first Winnetou movie by Karl May. A group of American settlers is laying a railroad in the middle of the 19th century, somewhere in the west of the, at this time, still young nation, the USA. They are observed by some Indians who see another group of settlers approaching the place. Even if this is only a fictitious movie scene, it really happened like this or something similar. But what are the real backgrounds of the scene? What are the settlers really doing so deep in the west of the USA? And what does all of this have to do with an alleged divine mission? Let's talk about it. The most important keyword we should clarify at first is manifest destiny. And to put it briefly, a lot of Americans and people who wanted to become Americans believed that God personally blessed the USA and its immigrants, and that it was his mission to the settlers to colonize the land and expand his powers. Thus, they thought of themselves as superior to other people and considered themselves the better kind of people whose path was set by God. So, in conclusion, the term manifest destiny refers to the attitude, the very strong belief during the 17th, 18th and 19th century that the United States not only could but should, because it was a religious obligation, stretch itself from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast, regardless of who was in their way. But let's turn back time a bit and talk about how the first settlers came to America in the first place. Because just over a century after the discovery of America, the first ship of settlers carrying Puritans arrived in America in 1620. As a reminder, the Puritans were a religious group who were discriminated in England because of their religious beliefs and felt called to immigrate to America in reference to manifest destiny. The 41 families on board the so-called Mayflower wanted the same rights to apply to all inhabitants of their colony, because in America, in contrast to Europe at that time, all people should be equal before the law. Many more people were to follow them, and things went well for the first years. The settlers in the US could live their lives more or less freely and manage themselves. In return, they only had to pay some taxes to the mainland of England and live with the fact that legally they still belonged to England. But at some point it all became too much to them, especially because they were not allowed to have a say in English politics. When the English king invented new taxes, more and more haphazardly, there was an uprising in the colonies. The 13 states of the East Coast, which existed until then, suddenly found themselves at war against their actual homeland, led by a general who would later go down in history as the first president of the United States of America, George Washington. He was one of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1767, the Independence Day, and founded their own state. The war itself continued for a few years afterwards, but it was finally won by the USA and its supporters, and England granted the newly founded states all eastern territories up to the Mississippi. Here, of course, the Western Expansion did not end, because the settlers, of course, wanted more land, and they had to conquer it from the natives. In countless small or larger conflicts with the Indians, they pushed them further and further away from their actual territory. If the Indians cooperated peacefully, they were relocated. If they opposed the supposedly civilized Americans, they were wiped out and killed. The so-called Indian Removal Act, which was introduced by President Jackson in 1830, resulted in the death or removal of hundreds of thousands of Indians. Indian removal fits seamlessly into the narrative of Western expansion as expressed, for example, by John Gust in his 1872 painting Progress. Here, indigenous tribesmen, along with bisons and bears, flee from the pioneers of progress bringing civilization. Fence-building farmers pushing iron plows, carriages and railroads. Lady Columbia, a mythical personification of the United States, in a dress with a schoolbook in one hand and a telegraph cable in the other hand. The image illustrates the complete ideology that the US used to justify the territorial appropriation of indigenous land. the Homestead Act of 1862, through which the US government distributed more than 500,000 square miles of land west of the Mississippi River to settlers for free, and under certain conditions summoned the sellout of indigenous land and prepared the ground for mass immigration from overseas. The first half of the 19th century was a period of immense growth in territory, population and economy for the United States. To emphasize the federal element, territorial expansion and the opening of new lands will not be accompanied by a western expansion of the pre-existing individual states, but rather by the creation of new states. On average, the nation grew by one new state every 3 years during this period. Even though Hawaii and Alaska, the last two new states, were not admitted to the states until 1959, real western expansionism ended with the end of the 19th century. Due to the completion of the railroads in this period, all territories of the US were easily and relatively quickly accessible for the people. The last resistance of the Indians were broken, and the nation also survived a civil war within the US. From the original idea of some religious groups who wanted to escape from their oppression, a global power emerged. So now let's look again at the scene from the beginning of this video, because this here symbolizes more than an innocent construction of a railroad line, more than the thought of a better life for some Europeans. It symbolizes the suffering that the conquest of the United States brought to indigenous people. Without being able to do anything against the colonialists and their ideology, they had to watch how they were driven out of their own country. Cheers!